if you type in Project 2025, you'll get a lot of videos like this, the new fascist playbook. Would you describe Project 2025 as a fascist playbook or even fascist adjacent?
I think that is probably going a little far. I mean, like it's
I would agree that it is definitely not a fascist playbook. And anyone who says so, we can both say are spreading misinformation, correct?
I mean, it's you know,
that's Second Thought.
Yeah.
Sam Cedar, Kyle Kalinske.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's
purveyors of misinformation.
It's sensationalism, as is so often the case with these sorts of things. You know, the sort of the left-wingers are really sort of sensationalizing it for their own purposes.
America finally has its own Mein Kampf. That's right. The wrong on the right have come up with a plan to take everyone's rights away, which is so wrong, except for fat, doughy, conservative white guys. And it's called the 2025 Project.
I mean, the thing is, like, it's a diverse document. It's a long document. It has many authors. It has many chapters. It explores public policy from a vast number of different directions. You know, I would be lying if I said that most of it was an agenda that I was necessarily down for. But, you know, there are parts of it that I agree with. There's parts of it that I think make sense as a conservative agenda for America in 2025 and forward. But there's a lot of stuff that I think reflects a kind of like crankish, very far right agenda that I don't think most Americans are interested in.
I get told I'm fascist or a far right reactionary because I consider voting for Trump. And then I hear Project 2025 being the new fascist playbook and being told, don't you understand, if you vote for Trump, you will implement this fascist playbook?
Okay, but let's talk about what it actually says then, Paul. Let's
sure. Well, to be fair, there's 920 pages. So
there are. I didn't read it all, but like we looked at parts that were interesting.
We did. So
what was your impression of the parts you looked
at? They made sense to me.
Yeah.
Now, the overall thesis, just for people watching, Heritage Foundation, conservatives generally believe in small government.
Yes.
Their fundamental critique is that there was some major historical event in like 1920-ish when the structure of government changed from 3 branches to what is called politics and administration. There's a not secret, but basically a 4th branch of government called the administrative branch that popped up as an extension of the executive branch. They're very not happy with it. It's a lot of it. That's the deep state. When people talk about the deep state or the permanent state, or, you know, they're very anti that. And to the degree that I understand it, I'm also anti that. It makes sense that we should fire many of the bureaucrats in the FBI, especially when they're explicitly partisan, like Peter Strzok, for example. Okay.
And this is the part of the report that's gotten the most attention. And I think when people talk about sort of the fascist kind of character of it, I think a lot of it refers to the idea of, you know, that in the chapter of the report that talks about the bureaucracy, it is very much supporting the idea that the president should have more power to fire bureaucrats and, you know,
which I agree with 100%.
It argues for
anyone who disagrees.
It argues for like a pretty dramatic shakeup of the federal bureaucracy. I mean, usually not just as an end unto itself, but usually towards specific policy ends. Like, so for example, like here's a classic example. And this is, you know, they basically argue that like anything to do with climate change should be like shut down. That like the president should just like shut down any like administrative agency that has any mandate to deal with climate change in any way, you know, because the report sort of characterizes climate change as this kind of like radical, extreme, fanatical kind of agenda that should be purged from the federal civil service, right? So it's like, to the extent that making the president more powerful is useful, it is useful in part because based on the opinions of the authors in the report, that there is this kind of like toxic weed within, you know, the federal civil service, which is climate advocacy, and that just needs to be eradicated.
Well, sure. I think it's a perfectly reasonable position to believe that climate change is a problem, but it is not a problem that is worth dismantling our entire economic and political structures to address. That aside, what I want to get to is the one I sent you. The principal accusation of fascism are, well, first off, I don't understand at all how shrinking the federal government and entrusting more power to the states is somehow fascist and, you know, a dictatorship. It's the exact opposite.
But no, I mean, it's not about more power to the states that has people concerned. It's more power to the president.
To the president, sure. In that the president has more control over the bureaucrats of the administrative state, which I think is perfectly reasonable.
I agree to a point, right? And I think the report actually makes this argument, and I think about this in the context of Canada and elsewhere, right? Which is the idea that the president has a mandate, and the president, because he's directly elected by the people, is a representative of the public will, and that the bureaucrats aren't elected by anybody, and thus they don't have a mandate to do what they do. That opinion is not necessarily broadly shared. I think that these days a lot of people believe, and this is a sort of conflict that you see all over the world, including in Israel, this idea that an elected government should have some degree of checks on his power within the civil service, and that the civil servants should sort of know more than the elected politicians, and thus have a kind of right, and that there's something undemocratic when an elected politician is that sort of cavalier about the advice of elected or of unelected bureaucrats, that he just seeks to run roughshod over them, even when they know more than he does. I think that's an opinion that people can have. I think that there's some nuance there, and I'm pretty critical of it, but it's worth noting that this is, I think a lot of people think, is part of the American democratic system.
What I would like to highlight is that you and I agree that anyone and everyone who says that Project 2025 is fascism is wrong.
What do you think what would a fascist agenda look like, Paul?
That's a good question. How about that's a good question. What would a fascist agenda look like? Probably further expansion of the military and police state. I would say expansion of the surveillance state would be probably the principal one. Implementing, I guess look at what China does. More CCTVs, more AI, social credit system type stuff. That would be pretty fascistic in my opinion.
Yeah.
The point is, we can talk about this with clear minds, right? It's not some fascist playbook. Now, what we should talk about, one of the principal accusations, that it's very anti-LGBTQ.
Yeah.
And I'd like to discuss this with you because I'm sympathetic to some of this. I'm unsure about other points. And then we can talk about the other portion, which you brought up, the abortion part.
Yeah.
So basically, this whole PDF is, literally, the way that it's presented is the Heritage Foundation wrote this PDF, and they're going to give it to all the federal bureaucrats who Trump is going to appoint. And they can take this PDF and use it as a guidebook of hey, once you've got security, they literally have a whole page on how to get security clearance. Yeah. If you're onboarding at a new job or something, here's how you get all your access IDs. Okay, once you have all that, here are the steps to follow.
Some of the authors will probably just be directly appointed to the Trump administration.
Sure. So this is in regard to sex discrimination. I want to get your thoughts on this.
Yes.
Sex discrimination. The Biden administration, LGBT advocates, and some federal courts have attempted to expand the scope and definition of sex discrimination based on a Supreme Court decision, Bostock, which held that an employer who fires someone simply for being homosexual or transgender violates Title VII's prohibition against sex discrimination. The court explicitly limited its holding to the hiring-firing context and did not purport to address other issues such as bathrooms, locker rooms, dress codes, or other laws prohibiting sex discrimination. And they used transgender status rather than gender identity. To put it simply, in Bostock versus Clayton County, it was made clear that you cannot fire someone just because they're gay or just because they're transgender.
Yes.
What the Heritage Foundation alleges is that the scope of that was limited to hiring and firing, which is why they say, as the first point in this LGBT issue, restrict the application of Bostock. The new administration should restrict its application to orientation and transgender status in context of hiring and firing. In other words, Project 2025 reaffirms the belief that it is wrong to fire someone based on sexual orientation.
No, that's not what they do. No, that's not what they're saying, Paul. They're saying that
Correct me. This is my interpretation. Yes, that is why I brought you here. I'm happy to change my mind in real time. This is how I read it. Tell me what I'm getting wrong.
Paul, what the purpose of what that sentence is communicating is that the court has mandated that there is a legal obligation. And what the authors of the report are saying is that what the court ruled has been misinterpreted as being broader than what they actually ruled. And so what the report is saying is that we recommend that the government do the bare minimum to be in compliance with the law.
Right. In the context of hiring and firing.
Yes.
So that's right. So Project 2020. So this is the situation that's presented itself.
Yes.
Project 2025 is saying we should restrict the court's interpretation
Yes.
so that we continue to make it illegal for a company to say, oh, you're gay or oh, you're transgender, I'm going to fire you. That remains as illegal as saying, oh, you're black or oh, you're white, we're going to fire you for that. What they do not like, and what I agree with, I think is—
But they're not saying they like it. It's Paul, you're mischaracterizing this. It's not about what they like. It's what we have to do to be in compliance with the law. You know, the administration cannot say—
I don't think I said it's what they like. It said they want to limit it to this.
They don't want anything. Well, they do want to limit to that. You're correct about that. But you're sort of—
Okay, so what are you fighting me on?
Pardon me?
What are you fighting me on?
No. You're sort of character. I feel like your tone is sort of suggesting like, well, even the Trump administration isn't going to do. It's like they don't have a right to. They cannot stop. They cannot go back to like discriminating against people on the basis.
Sure. I'm sure there are people who wrote this who would like to do all kinds of horrible things.
Yeah,
but
they have to obey the law. They have to obey the law. So what they're doing is they're just saying, we will interpret the law in the most narrow way possible. We will be compliant with the letter of the law and nothing else. So I'm not going to give them credit for that.
Okay, here's why I think that's a great idea. Because it specifically says we should limit it to the context of hiring and firing, but we should not expand it to things like bathrooms and locker rooms. In other words, if I'm a business and I say, I have a spa in California, let's call it the Wee Spa, and I would like to have a locker room separated by sex, not gender identity. I want to have a male locker room and a female locker room. I should be allowed to do that as a business owner. And I should be allowed to say, if you are a male, independent of your gender identity, but if you are a biological male, your sex is male, you are not allowed in our female locker rooms. And that should be perfectly legal. I agree with that. The over-interpretation of Bostock, which is what Project 25 is complaining about, would say that actually a small business is not allowed to separate locker rooms by sex because that's a violation of gender identity or whatever. And it's like, that's why the Wee Spa incident happened. Which, for those who don't remember, Wee Spa was a biological male with a record of sexual assault trying to force his way into a female locker room. And it was a big controversy for obvious reasons. There were young girls in there. And I am more than happy to say, I think a business that wants to have sex-segregated institutions, locker rooms, bathrooms I'm less concerned about because there's stalls, but places where people get publicly naked, it's perfectly reasonable to say they should be allowed to do that. Do you disagree with that?
I think it is important that we understand, what is the motive of trying to interpret the law as narrowly as possible? Like, to
do exactly what I just said, to stop that from happening.
Yeah, but to me, I don't know. Like, I read it and it just strikes me as like coming from just such a deeply sort of like uncharitable place. So like, for example, and what emphasizes this is that if you scroll down to point number 3, read point number 3, skip over point number 2 because who cares?
Right here?
Point number 3, yeah.
Rescind regulations prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, and sex characteristics. The president should direct agencies to rescind regulations interpreting sex discrimination provisions as prohibiting discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, etc.
So what is the point of that?
Exactly what I just said.
No, because like, this
sex discrimination is referring to biological sex. That's what the original court case was referring to. And what this is saying is stop including sexual orientation and gender identity in the definition of sex discrimination. So if I identify as female, too bad. You don't get to go to the female locker room.
Why do we want more discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation?
So that biological males do not enter locker rooms with underage females, like what happened with Wee Spa.
Forget about gender identity or transgender status or sex characteristics. Why is
that's sexual, 3 things on here.
Why is sexual orientation in there? Why is sexual orientation?
I don't know. I don't know what this means. I don't know in terms of like, is sex identity the same as sexual orientation?
It's not. And that's the point, right? The point is saying that they think.
Go ahead.
No, listen to this. Like, the sort of the right-wing mindset that is motivating this is that discrimination against homosexuals and transgender people and people with different gender identities and so on and so forth, like that's no big deal. Like discriminating against LGBT people is basically fine. And that the government should have a free hand to allow that to happen in America. Like that is very obviously the motivation that is coming, because a lot of these people are real, kind of like right-wing Christian types, and they sort of don't really view these identities as legitimate. And they think that if businesses and private people and whatever want to discriminate against these folks, then that's
okay. All right. Here we have a situation that Foucault predicted, and all the postmodernists accurately predicted. You have your narrative.
Yeah.
And I have mine.
Yeah.
Your narrative is that everyone who's part of this just axiomatically hates gay people, hates transgender people, and wants to cause.
And why do I think that, Paul?
Because it's partly true.
Yes.
There are plenty of people, as you know, who I have made plenty of videos about for the last 3 years saying you crazy conservative freaks who want to prevent transgender adults from getting whatever surgery they want, go fuck yourself. You
and
crazy
also just to fire gay people from jobs because they don't like gay people, right?
Exactly. And all the ones who say, oh, well, actually being gay is the same as being, the fucking the Jeffrey Epstein type shit, which is fucked up and insane and disgusting. And part of the reason I believe it's important to say that and to push for and to make the case that I'm making is so that the only people rightly calling out all the crazy fucking shit with WeSpa or Jeffrey Epstein or whatever it is are not the insane right-wingers, because that shit is bad, and you can be a sane person and say, hey, a small number of people do participate in that. But this is my point. You just asked me, why do you believe that? Because it's partly true, right? There are some people, and not even an insignificant minority, but perhaps a dangerous minority that genuinely believe that to be transgender or to be gay is to be a bad thing that needs to be rooted out.
Yes.
Okay.
I believe
that's true. So I understand why you have the belief that you have.
Yeah.
Now, JJ, if I was wearing my empathy hoodie, I would point to it and say, let me ask you now, do you understand why I and many other people have the attitude that I have towards, for example, the kind of shit that happens at WeSpa?
Yes, I do understand. Okay. I just think that in proportion.
So is the truth not in the enlightened center, as always? How many more podcasts do we have to do before you finally adopt the true label? Okay, the truth is in the middle. Okay. Go ahead.
All right. I guess I would say two things. One thing is that I would say
three things that
I think that the issue of discrimination against LGBT people is probably the bigger problem than, weirdos infiltrating, gender exclusive spaces on
you could be right.
false pretenses.
You absolutely could be right. And there are plenty of reasons to believe what you just said.
Yes. And therefore, I am suspicious of a government that thinks that sort of stripping away legal protections, anti-discrimination protections for LGBT people is a leading priority. Because I just think that reflects a kind of prejudiced assessment of what are the big problems facing America, frankly. And I think that the idea that, because, if I may sort of phrase this the way that you would always phrase it, turning it into questions, it's like, I'm sure you would agree, Paul, that anti-LGBT discrimination is an issue, and that a lot of perfectly qualified...
that I talk about regularly.
Yes, and perfectly qualified LGBT people, gay people, trans people, and so on, are arbitrarily discriminated against because of who they are and how they present and all the rest of it. And that it's
religious fundamentalism and all this bullshit interpretations of the Bible from Leviticus and all this
or
shit.
Even just some gay guy tries to apply for a job and maybe he's a little flamboyant or effeminate, and then the boss doesn't really like it, and so he's like, I don't want you here. I'm gonna go with
no doubt
else.
that happens all the time.
Yes, and so it strikes me as that the federal government, the executive branch, has an obligation to enforce anti-discrimination laws. It's one of their mandates. They do it in terms of sexism, they do it in terms of racism, and now, in the wake of new court rulings and executive branch policy, they do it in the service of anti-LGBT discrimination, protecting against it. And I just think that a government in the year 2025 that kind of comes to power and thinks that this is kind of a made up non-issue that can just be casually discarded, I'm a little bit skeptical of that government, in the same way that I'm skeptical of other parts in the report that frame climate change as just basically a big nothing. See, this is the problem right here. This is the problem with polarization in modern America, is that, you know, there are a lot of issues that have become coded as one thing or the other. And that when an issue becomes ideologically coded, the side whose issue that is not becomes sort of, in my mind, kind of irrationally hostile to it and incurious about it. So I think that when you read this report, one kind of consistent theme of it is that anything that is framed as being an issue of the left or a thing that left-wingers care about is sort of framed as being ipso facto illegitimate and pointless, and will often be in scare quotes and this kind of thing. And I think that LGBT rights is one of those issues. I think climate change is one of those issues. I think we could go through the list and see several other issues in which there's just kind of like a sneering contempt that anyone could possibly think this matters, and that the only reason why the current Biden administration thinks these things matter is because they're in the hawk of some sort of like radical, crazy ideology, and that when Trump and his cronies get in, you know, part of cleaning house is just getting rid of anything that sniffs of a leftist kind of policy or priority.
I empathize with you, and I hope that, no, I don't hope, I know that you know that precisely all of the criticisms that you have just laid out are not criticisms that I would make, or that I'm concerned, that I think.
Yeah.
Well, JJ, the same Bible that bans pork said no gay people, so away with you fools. Yeah. I think it's nonsense. Now, let's move on to the next piece of this policy document that I have not seen yet.
Okay.
So I'll allow you to bury me.
Yeah.
I do want to apologize. I will issue an apology on behalf of both of us.
Yeah.
We have been saying LGBTQ.
Yeah.
We should be saying 2S LGBTQIA++.
I don't think that's what the report says.
But that's what the right term is, as Justin Trudeau, our fearless leader.
Yeah.
And non-racist blackface wearer.
The Canadian government has been using a pretty convoluted acronym that I feel like most people do not use, and it reflects a kind of political priority, an ideological perspective.
Do you agree with it? Do you think, hold on, I'm going to clip this. We're going to clip this. Do you think that 2S LGBTQIA++ premium is too long of an acronym? Yes or no, JJ? You're part of the G.
I do, and I've often kind of thought that, you know, that I remember like many years ago, there was some guy or some half-assed movement that was like pushing that the acronym should just be like GSD, like gender and sexual diversity. Like that should be the term that should be used to kind of describe all people.
Seems to make sense.
Like, pardon me?
That makes sense.
Yeah, and that's what I thought. Like I thought that that's fine. Like it's I mean, it's not because like I consider the different people captured in that long acronym to somehow be illegitimate or whatever. It's just that it's an impractical thing to say. And also I think it's just too literal, right? Like it's the same reason where it's like where we have the modified rainbow flag and we have to keep adding things to it to be more inclusive, because people cannot handle the idea that something can be inclusive and abstract and condensed. It's that instead it has to be literal.
You know the argument for it, right? You know why they lump everyone together like that, right?
Why
you know what the academic rationale underneath it is?
Of why things have to be so literal.
Of why we use terms like person of color and why we use LGBTQ2IS+, and we lump all of them together instead of separate. Do you know what the academic progressive think tank rationale is?
Yeah, that's not exactly what I'm criticizing, but you tell me.
I'm asking
this. Okay, why?
Again, as someone who is a credentialed gender studies minor, it's because all of those people suffer oppression along a similar dimension. In the case of person of color, you might think, hey, isn't it racist to lump everyone who isn't white in one category? I would say, yeah. But if you have your brain rot from this intersectional nonsense, then you believe that everyone who is not white has been oppressed, and therefore we can lump them together because they've all been oppressed similarly. But because that does not map onto reality, not all races have been oppressed equally and in the same way, in the same systemic way that other races have. comes off as completely ignorant. And same with the LGBTQ2SI, 2A plus plus premium.
I mean,
like, well, they've all been oppressed by the cisgender hetero, cisgender male, cisgender straight male. So that's why they lump everyone together, even though they have nothing to do with each other.
I'm not. Well, I mean, like, it's like, I think that people have distinct identities and distinct interests. I don't think it's completely irrational to suggest that sort of non-white people have some degree of collective interest, just as I think that sexual and gender diverse people have some degree of collective interest. So like, I don't think that's the only or the only way in which you kind of agitate for your rights. I think, though, that it's not illegitimate to sort of conceptualize yourself as being part of a larger group of shared interests. My bigger problem is just that I think that when you are participating as part of a diverse community, you don't have to acknowledge the diversity of your community quite so literally. Like, you can come up with a broad catch-all term, and that people are capable of conceptualizing things.
Sure. Yeah, it's look, everything's trade-off. Like when people talk about the Black community, part of me goes, that's a terrible way to conceptualize it, and part of me goes, I understand why people use that.
Yeah.
But there's all kinds of nuance there. Anyway, let's get to. Would you rather look at the abortion part or the foreign policy part?
Well, we can look at. You can tell me what you think of the abortion part.
Let's go to the abortion part. 457.
Okay.
All right, here we go.
Okay, so let me.
I'll set the context. Go ahead.
I'll read it. Actually, here, go back to 457. Okay, so it says here, abortion pills pose the single greatest threat to unborn children in a post-Roe world. The rate of chemical abortion in the U.S. has increased by more than 150% in the past decade. More than half of annual abortions in the U.S. are chemical rather than surgical. So this is interesting to me because this, for many years, groups like Heritage had been agitating for Roe v. Wade to be overturned. And now, of course, Roe v. Wade has been overturned. And this has kind of left some of these think tanky right-wing policy people with, they're kind of like the dog that caught the bone, right? Or that caught the car. It's like, well, where do we go from here? And I think that a lot of sort of progressive people have been worried, like, what's next on the chopping block? Like, they're not just going to sort of lean back and put their hands behind their head and say, well, that's the end of abortion, time to, put things aside, right? It's like, no, the war on abortion is continuing to go on. And I think it's just very interesting that now abortion pills are sort of the crime that is sort of seen as needs to be prosecuted, right? So, and then when you scroll down, you see like there's a great deal of talk about the need to sort of restrict any sort of pill-based abortion procedures or abortive. I don't know how you say that word.
Which one?
I don't know if they use it here, but like when you're describing a pill that sort of induces an abortion, it's called like an abortifacient or something. I don't know how you say it. But and there's also a lot of
reverses approval. So whatever is it mivistaprone? Or how do you, where'd it go? Mifepristone.
Yeah.
They want to reverse its approval.
Yes. And you can see that they talk more about the similar. You scroll down further.
Yep.
Mail order abortions. We got to crack down on that.
Yes, it's steeped in right-wing excess.
Yes, and there's even talk as well about birth control. It doesn't go so far as to say we should, ban birth control or agitate for its, illegality or anything like that. But they say that the future Republican administration should side with employers who do not want to provide birth control as part of their Obamacare mandates and this sort of thing. So it's a pretty sort of strict agenda that we want to see less birth control in America and less abortion pills in America. And I was just sort of curious what you think about that agenda.
Well, I think that if you believe that the moment that a sperm fertilizes an egg, that is a human being attendant with all divine rights that we associate with a conscious human being, I think that's insane. I think that's right-wing excess.
Yes.
I am not, based on what I just saw there, that's not good. Now, it seems somewhat specific to mifepristone. Let me pull it back up. Whoops. Which, by the way, I will share this in the description and the comment section right now for people who want to look at it.
No, but you can see it says
are states. Does it suggest anything about overturning the ability of states to ensure protections for abortion?
Well, I believe it says that the federal government should do whatever it can to, prevent states from doing this kind of thing, right? I mean, the federal government obviously has limited power in what it can practically do to affect states, because but the federal government controls the approval of drugs through the FDA, so they clearly say that the FDA should withdraw approval for abortion drugs.
Yeah, if this, again, I don't know anything about this mifepristone.
But they also just say, like that's one example that they cite, but you can sort of see immediately, like they talk about abortion pills in the general sense, and you can see over there that they say reverse approval of chemical abortion drugs because they believe that this was done illegitimately and so on.
Interesting. Well, I guess I'm against that.
Mm-hmm.
Now the question is this enough to say I would rather vote for Joe Biden than Donald Trump?
Well, I guess it depends how important you believe it is that not only because the fact is we know that the Republican administration does not believe that women have a right to abortion and will do nothing in their power to make a traditional sort of surgical abortion possible. But now we know that they also don't believe that women should have a right to any sort of pill-induced abortion.
Do you think there is a period at which it's too late or that it should be illegal to get an abortion? I think as a sort of general matter, I am sympathetic to that position, the sort of the European kind of position and all that. But at the same time, pretty strict abortion laws.
Yeah, they do. But at the same time, the abortion laws that exist in Europe were the product of a kind of broad bipartisan consensus in a very particular period of time. And I just think that it's very difficult to imagine that kind of consensus emerging in America with politics being what they are. I as well, the Republican Party has just become a lot more radicalized on this issue, where they're kind of not interested in doing anything that resembles a compromise post-Roe. All of sort of like the leading Republican, well, except for maybe Nikki Haley, are positing that never, like the best abortions are no abortions in any context all the time.
That's actually not. Well, first off, just for reference, France had a 12. This is 2022. Oh. This was in 2022, so it may have changed, but we're going to go with whatever Google fed me first.
Yes. This is Human Rights Watch, right?
Is it Human Rights Watch? Yeah, so 12-week, they upped it to 14 weeks in France, which mirrors Spain. Sweden, it's up to 18 weeks. So that would be the middle of the second trimester. 18 weeks is 4.5 months, right? So that's middle of the second trimester. Mm-hmm. Netherlands is up to 24 weeks. So when you talk about because you mentioned surgical abortions earlier.
Yeah.
Well, my understanding is surgical abortions are ones that are quite past fetal development into the third trimester or second or third trimester.
Well, I mean, no, I don't know how to describe it. I just mean like, a traditional abortion as opposed to a abortion. Yeah.
Well, to the point about Trump, or rather the Republicans, everyone but Nikki Haley, Trump specifically said and was lambasted for saying that Ron DeSantis' heartbeat bill was too far.
Yeah.
Do you think Donald Trump is subject to this Christo-fascist mentality?
Well, do you think
he's particularly religious?
Okay. Do you think that
it's popular?
Okay. Do you think that in some sort of imaginary world, I mean, this will never happen, but if say like Speaker Mike Johnson passes his perfect no abortions ever bill, and then it goes to President Trump's desk, do you think that Trump would veto that bill?
He could. He
could. I don't know if I would bet money on it. I would.
Well, maybe. Like, in my mind, as per Steve Bannon, once again, Trump is not super principled. He cares more about what's popular. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Trump does what people tell him to do. I think that he is a very suggestible person, and that if he fills his government,
he fired Steve Bannon. So I don't know how amenable he is to being told what to do. But
well, he fires people when they threaten his ego, and Steve Bannon, has a big ego of his own, and there's only so much space in life. That many.
Despite your previously mentioned experience in elite circles, I do not suspect you have too much of an insight on Trump's internal psychology. But my point is, abortion.
Hold on, let me finish my point, because my point was that even if you accept that Trump is malleable or whatever, it's like he fills his government with real hard right-wing people. And I think that the people that are going to be in his inner circle are going to be even more hard and right-wing and more extreme Christians than he had in his previous government. And so I think that the idea that there's going to be people in his inner circle in the Oval Office giving him counsel and advice who are going to be saying like, listen, Mr. President, it's time to strike a moderate position on abortion, as opposed to people that are going to be saying like, listen, Mr. President, we have the possibility for a total all-encompassing abortion ban within our grasp, and you'd be a fool not to seize this. You'll be remembered in history as the greatest president ever for, blah, blah, blah.
Well, that hypothetical assumes there is a situation in which that opportunity arises. And given public opinion about abortion, which I believe is generally, I would say, pro-choice, which is a terrible binary term we've come up with. I am against the binary in some sense, pro-choice versus pro-life being one of them.
Yeah.
I don't think that situation would arise. And also, when you say Trump surrounds himself with hard right people, do you think that Steve Bannon is far right?
Yes, obviously he is.
Okay, well then, fair enough.
Look, and having this conversation all the time.
Because he's not. Because based on what I've listened to, based on the many hours of interviews that I've listened to,
well, you should listen to his
podcast. Even approximately approaching like Matt Walsh or Nick Fuentes or any of these people that I would regard as far right. Steve Bannon is an economic left-winger by far. He wanted to get the top marginal tax rate at 44%.
Yeah, but that's not what the Trump administration. The Trump administration cut the top tax rate. Like we judge, and Steve
Bannon said that was wrong. Steve Bannon was pissed about that.
Steve Bannon still says that Donald Trump is the best man in the world, and he has to be elected because this is the most important thing that has ever happened. So I mean,
no one is perfect by anyone's standard.
I judge Steve Bannon by who he wants to put in the Oval Office, and who he wants to put in the Oval Office is Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has an agenda that perhaps is not, what Steve Bannon claims his agenda is, but Steve Bannon's bigger agenda is trusting Donald Trump to make the right decisions. So I think we judge.
I will, as I said, I will listen, or I will watch on Rumble, because it's banned on YouTube because censorship is the dumbest fucking thing that ever happened. I will watch on Rumble Steve Bannon's interview.
Listen to it. I just challenge you to listen to an episode of his podcast. Listen to the
challenge. As I said via text, challenge accepted. Let's wrap this up, JJ. I want to address actually a comment that just popped up.
Okay.
Because this is indicative of a theme here.
Yeah.
Jung, referring to me, I presume, is a right winger who claims to be a centrist.
Yes.
What do you think about that comment?
I think that's more accurate than not. I do think that whenever I talk, because at this point, Paul, you and I have done our crackpot show a number of times, and I hear from a number of my people that watch it, and I feel like the overwhelming consensus is that you are like a right-wing person.
Compared to you, of course, I would not even dispute that. That compared to you,
I myself am known to be conservative, right? And so the fact is that like
you may be known to be that. Are you actually? Would you describe yourself as? How about this? Let's do this. Compared to the average American, the average independent voter, the average American who's more or less in the center of the political spectrum, whatever. Do you think that I am more? Do you think that I am right wing or left wing compared to the average American?
Right wing, because you're open minded.
And what do you think you are?
I think that I'm probably actually closer to a sort of median kind of centrist.
Do you? You think you're the true centrist? You don't think you're more left wing than the average American?
No, I don't think so. I think it depends on the issue. I think that
same.
Yeah. But I mean like the thing that these sorts of questions are difficult.
You think my utter opposition to all and every possible thing that could be described as religious fundamentalist. Which is axiomatic to the right-wing position.
Yeah.
My utter rejection of the white supremacist bullshit.
Yeah.
The Christo-fascist, the white supremacist, all this bullshit. You think that makes me right-wing still?
No, well, what makes you right-wing is that you're open-minded about voting for a man who would fill his government full of religious fundamentalists and Christian or white nationalist adjacent people, right? And to me,
and you're left-wing because you're open-minded about a left-wing person filling his cabinet full of globalists who don't believe in a nation state. But so we can lob accusations all day.
No, but it's not. This is like the kind of faulty parallelism that right-wingers constantly engage in, right? Because it's this idea that like the Biden administration is somehow as far left as the Trump administration is far right, and that therefore you're basically just choosing between two extremes, and that the adjudication is basically which extreme is in some way like milder or less consequential.
That's fair. Well, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Let's say I accept your framing that I am more right-wing than the average American.
Yeah.
You don't have a problem with that because you believe both the right wing and left wing are correct some of the time, depending on the issue, right?
Yeah, but I think that,
Yeah, he says very carefully and cautiously as if he doesn't believe that.
The thing is that...
Are you a centrist or are you not, JJ?
It comes down, like so much of, and I don't like to be too reductive about this, but a lot of it really just does come down to Donald Trump at the end of the day, right? We are not living in normal political times. We are living at the time where I honestly believe that American democracy faces a moment of crisis like never before. And I do think like American democracy is on the line. And I think that Donald Trump, who is already, I think, the worst president certainly in modern American history, would be objectively the worst president in American history if he was to get a second term. Like, I think that the amount of damage that he would do, not only to, public policy, but also to the American constitutional order itself, cannot be underestimated. Hold on, what is this? This guy is saying.
So the reason I pull this comment up is to make it perfectly clear to you. Yeah. I care less about everyone watching, especially if they're from your audience. But to make it perfectly clear that it's comments like these that create a utter level of certainty that I know that many, not most, although maybe most, but many of the people who criticize me have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. The term globalist, a literal anti-Semitic, I believe that's dog whistle, adopted by Alex Jones. Yuval Noah Harari and the members of the World Economic Forum literally refer to themselves and their ideology as globalist. And if I may end with this beautiful piece of information to wrap up this podcast, because it all comes back to globalism at the end of the day, and Jeffrey Epstein and his associates and the communities that have constructed him, according to Eric Weinstein. I suspect are more globalist sympathetic. But do you have any thoughts about that? Do you believe the term globalist is an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist term?
I think it started out that way, but has now become sort of digested into the cultural mainstream. Like when I was like, it's interesting because...
So in other words, that person's comment is completely and utterly wrong.
Well,
in every possible way.
I mean, I think
you'd do yourself many more favors if you were more certain in your critique.
I mean, I think that globalism is not unto itself an anti-Semitic term. I definitely think like a lot of anti-Semites are fond of that term. But, like I would use that term now to do, like, I often sort of think about like in Canada, the Liberal Party, and this is actually like a video I want to make sometime in the future, that the Liberal Party basically like has a kind of globalist wing and then kind of a Quebec wing. And that in some ways, like it's a constant battle to decide who will be the head of the party. Will he represent the kind of globalist wing or will he represent the French, the Quebec wing? And like, so like, that's like when I make that video someday, I would use that term globalist because
there you go.
The term has sort of
Fair enough. Well, hey, and if you would like to cite my video, steel manning and then destroying the World Economic Forum, you are free to use the following clips of the ideology of the WEF known as globalism.
France can't play football against Croatia unless the French and Croatians agree on the same rules for the game. And that's globalism in action. If you like the World Cup, you're already a globalist.
Yeah.
Now,
so like the thing is that's interesting about this, because like I remember when I was in college, and this was like the topic, this kind of topic, the integration of the world and all that in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union and blah 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 blah. Like that was still very much the hot issue of the time. And I remember at that time the term that people used was globalization. And that is a kind of term that has kind of fallen out of fashion a bit now for whatever reason. And people instead use sort of like the shorter and catchier globalist and globalism to kind of describe it. And I think like that makes maybe some sense as a sort of linguistic thing. But I definitely remember like there was a time in which globalization was kind of like the mainstream term, and then globalist was a kind of like somewhat darker, more kind of like nasty term. But language evolves, and I'm when it comes to language, as when it comes to most things, I'm a descriptivist, not a prescriptivist. And so I think that you acknowledge the way that words change, and people use that term in a different context than perhaps they used it 20 years ago. And it's like based, right? Like based.
You've been watching. Oh yeah. You've been watching a lot of Destiny.
Do I watch a lot of Destiny? No, I don't. I find like his videos are just like, I can't just watch like meandering streams where like nothing happens. Like I want something that's like punchy and edited and clear and concise and all that. So
that's fair.
I try to enjoy him, but even his like edited videos are like 2 hours long, and it's like, I'm not watching this. Like just
it's a certain.
I think he's a sharp guy. I wish he would make like scripted videos.
He uses the word descriptive and prescriptive a lot, which is why I brought that up. What I wanted to say is, can you please, before we wrap up here, can you please tell your audience to stop saying that globalist is anti-Semitic and that I am a right-wing conspiracy theorist?
Well, really you are a right-wing conspiracy theorist, so I will not tell them to not engage in that.
And you're a globalist shill. Fair enough?
I mean,
actually, according to my absolute boy, Eric, you're a Wittgensteinian.
What does that mean?
It means you subscribe, whether you know it or not, to the philosophy of Wittgenstein in his theory of language games, in that basically words mean whatever the utility the words provide. So what is a chair? Well, a chair is whatever you point at to someone to say, this is a chair and can you sit in it? Then it's good enough for our purposes.
Yeah.
And I also am a big fan of Wittgenstein. Anyway, do you have any final thoughts, reflections on this conversation? Which of us is going to be canceled first, you or me, do you think?
Well, I'm more famous than you, so like I have a higher rate of risk whenever I'm in any sort.
That's true. And listen, I've said this to you, and I've said this to your audience. Okay, the moment that you feel I am too hot for TV or too hot for YouTube, you are free to publicly condemn me. I already have several tweets in edit ready to launch off and fire off of all of our texts and whatnot and all of your Donald Rumsfeld payments. And I have checks that I've seen cash and all that, but it's fine. It's fine. I'll hold back on that.